Hello and good afternoon. My name is Ricky Lee, and I'd like to begin first of all by thanking the organizers of the conference, in particular Professor Kruger and Professor Butler, for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. I apologize very much that I am not able to be there in person as a result of conflicting engagements here in Australia. I would have liked very much to be able to do this presentation in a much more personal way, not to mention being able to participate in what I am sure will be fruitful discussions during the course of the conference. The topic that I wish to speak about this afternoon is blockchain in space, both in the context of the use of satellites or other space assets in the use of blockchain on Earth, as well as the use of blockchain technology in space operations and space missions, along with all the usual risks, challenges, and shortcomings that currently exist with blockchain. There are also some additional risks and challenges that are posed by the use of blockchain in the space sector that I wish to focus on. I, of course, don't profess to have any specialized expertise in blockchain. I'm also keenly aware that I am speaking to an audience that know about blockchain exponentially more than I do. What I hope to do this afternoon is to share with you some insights from the point of view of someone who have some experience and specialization in the space field and discuss in a practical sense some of the interrelationships that can exist between the space sector and blockchain technology. To that end, I propose to use my brief time talking about, quite briefly, the easier part, which is the use of space and satellite assets for blockchain use on Earth. And then I want to spend a bit more time on the different potentials and applications for the use of blockchain in the space sector and some of the risks and challenges that are posed by the use of blockchain in the space industry. So the use of space for blockchain has been tested and have to some very limited extent been operational for some time. The use of satellites presents two particular benefits for the use of blockchain on Earth. The first is the use of satellites as a means of secured authentication. The second is to provide an alternative or redundancy for the storage and access to blockchains. For instance, SpaceChain had launched satellites into low Earth orbit, which tests the concept of requiring communications and authentication with a satellite in order to perform a transaction. So just as much as we may access in a very basic and simplistic way sensitive information or websites with the use of a password, the idea is that communication with a satellite, the ability to communicate with a satellite, and the authentication of that communication by the satellite is the password or the key to be able to perform a transaction on a blockchain that is actually deployed and stored on Earth, giving it a much more sophisticated and added layer of security for the blockchain itself. There are, of course, technical requirements in order for this to occur, most primarily that there needs to be a constellation of these satellites in order to enable real-time and 24/7 access to the blockchain under optimal circumstances. But it is also this often need for 24/7 access that drives the other particular benefit for the use of satellites in blockchain, which is that satellite networks provide, in effect, an alternative or redundancy for the use of the internet as a means of verifying, accessing data, as well as performing transactions. We have seen in recent years outages, both in relation to electricity supply, as well as more specifically for internet services and connections. The idea of being able to store blockchains on satellites or deploy blockchains on satellites, or at least provide access to blockchains through satellites, gives the alternative to these system outages, but also in particular gives a means of truly global access to a blockchain that don't have regard to the availability of fiber optic networks or cellular mobile networks and other means of internet service coverage, so that no matter where one may be on Earth, you would nevertheless be able to access the blockchain information or perform transactions. Blockstream is perhaps the best example of this, where the Bitcoin blockchain is broadcast through the Blockstream satellite network to ensure that there is, well, it's not yet global because they don't have enough satellites, but the potential at least for a truly global coverage and access for the Bitcoin database that don't rely on ongoing and dependable access to the internet. Another example in relation to the use of satellites is to deploy the blockchain onto the satellite networks themselves. In 2021, a project driven primarily by JP Morgan Chase through the Connexus network, they had deployed a consensus quorum blockchain onto a GOM space satellite. And this was a proof of concept mission in the sense that it wasn't so much to actually deploy a blockchain for operational use, but to prove that the use of satellites in blockchain deployment is both viable and to some extent also preferable. This proof of concept involved executing a satellite to Earth token transfer, deploying an ERC20 contract, maintaining data integrity and synchronicity of the satellite ledger versus the ledger that is stored on a terrestrial network or terrestrial system, and also executed a transaction between two satellites without the need for communication with an Earth segment. This last bit is particularly important because it demonstrated the potential for a peer-to-peer data versus payment application that certainly have potentials in the space economy that is to come. And speaking of this space economy, the Aerospace Corporation 4 years ago identified a number of operational aspects in relation to the space sector where blockchain technology can be particularly useful. I want to focus this afternoon on the issue of supply chain management and risk management, data access, as well as some of the regulatory aspects and what may be the longer term potential for blockchain in relation to space operations. The most common satellite applications being satellite communications and remote sensing, they can both benefit greatly from the use of blockchain. Blockchain can protect the integrity and security of both the data and the communications. It allows, in particular, in the case of remote sensing data and any process imagery, allows for its tokenization so that transactions can be done in a much more secured and automated manner. It also allows for automating processes for data transfer between satellites and ground segments, as well as between satellites. What we are increasingly seeing in the space sector is that with the large constellation of satellites that are being deployed, there is a significant amount of redundant bandwidth and redundant orbital time that are not being used, in which the satellite can be used to acquire a large amount of data that may or may not be processed. This data may be valuable, but the value of that data may not be known until sometime down the track after the data has been acquired. One may want to look at the historical data either in the short term, particularly in a military context, for reconnaissance purposes, but also over the longer term in relation, for example, to agriculture and water applications. These data cannot viably be stored on board satellites for a long period of time. There are large arrays of satellite receiving and transmitting stations, one of the largest in the world of which is on Stewart Island in New Zealand, where satellites, as they fly over the southern hemisphere, particularly over the Southern Ocean, they can use that time where no useful data is really being collected or demanded commercially. They can use that in order to perform data transfers between the satellite and the Earth. Much of these processes can be automated as well as tokenized through the use of blockchain. And as I had mentioned in the previous slide, the potential for automating data versus payment transactions would also greatly improve the efficiency of utilizing satellites for communications and remote sensing purposes rather than through dedicated provider consumer transactions. It can also open up these satellite platforms to a much greater array of consumers for many different purposes, leaving aside for the moment some of the international and national security concerns that might flow from that. The more exciting aspect of where blockchain can be particularly useful is to facilitate private sector space missions that can involve multiple stakeholders, can be highly complex, involving different commercial demands from those different stakeholders with highly technical specifications, very precise engineering coordination with stringent regulatory requirements. The security, the accuracy, the reliability, and ongoing accessibility of the data, as well as the secured access that needs to be afforded to different stakeholders and providing ongoing information and data to regulatory agencies, plural, are all part and parcel of a typical space mission, even one that may be conducted on a very small scale to something that may be to the scale and size of Starlink. One of the difficulties that I have encountered in the years of working in the space sector is that very often as information and data passes from one hand to another, to another, to another, and in particular between different countries, there is a great potential for there to be errors, as well as either inadvertent or deliberate omission or changes to data that may flow from party to party. Blockchain gives us the potential to minimize these errors, ensuring data security, as well as tracking movement of both data, as well as the actual parts and components that are produced by subcontractors through the supply chain. They can automate the data transfer between stakeholders in relation to, for example, technical specifications, testing results, performance data, as well as improving the traceability and transparency of these processes. Rather than only talking through words spoken or written, I thought I might borrow this diagram from IBM and illustrate the use of a blockchain in a satellite launch operation. The same blockchain can contain the contractual documents as well as the transactions involved, as between the service provider, the customer, the manufacturer, the subcontractors, suppliers, the launch provider, and mission control, as well as satellite operations ground segments, in order to ensure that the data, the information, the specifications between all of these entities are aligned. At the same time, controlled access but reliable access to data, information, specifications, test results, quality control can be available to insurers, to different regulatory agencies. In this particular example, where the launch is of a US satellite for a US based customer, licensing is required for the launch itself with the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. The communications equipment requires licensing from the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, and also any transfer or use of space technology that may involve cross-border transfers of data and information requires licensing from the US Department of Commerce. A blockchain allows for automated, controlled, reliable, and up-to-date transfer of data and specifications that previously either needed to be done on paper or needed to be done through the internet or even through physical means such as a USB stick or a drive. That blockchain would remove much of these limitations, both in terms of time, in terms of accuracy, and in terms of reliability, not to mention security. In the longer term, blockchain also gives the potential to establish decentralized autonomous organizations that would democratize, for example, the significant funding that is needed for space operations through decentralized finance. They can allocate funds and resources using smart contracts that will allow for much more efficient and effective allocation of these resources. It can, as it is with a supply chain, share information and data on operational progress, and also provide a transparent and tamper-proof record of transactions involved in the entirety of the space operation. When it comes to a much larger scale and much more complex space operation, such as space stations or an asteroid mining operation, the use of such blockchain technology can be invaluable. There's also been some discussion that when we get to the point of actually mining asteroids, the resources from the asteroids themselves can be tokenized. And so blockchain can, in effect, become the commodity trading platform for space resources, either to supplement or to ultimately replace the existing commodity trade structures that exist on Earth. Finally, some of the challenges and risks. There are, of course, inherent drawbacks with blockchain, and I know I am certainly speaking to those who know more about these than I do. But the high resource requirements, computational requirements, the substantial data transfer and storage needs are particularly problematic when it comes to space, because the computing resources as well as the storage capacity of satellites are, by their very physical limitations, severely constrained. One of the things that JP Morgan had to do with the Kinesis trials or proof of concepts is that they needed to deploy a Kinesis blockchain where it had been modified significantly in order to minimize their use of memory and also minimize their use of computing power so that it can be deployed effectively on board a satellite. And they tested it using a Raspberry Pi on Earth before they actually deployed it onto the satellite. The usual slow speeds of processes involving blockchains, and Bitcoin is perhaps the best example of that, can also be difficult in an environment where very fast and very precise operations and responses, even if they're automated responses, can be essential. Finally, the examples that we have talked about has an underlying presumption, as the chart involving or put together by IBM showed. When we are conceptualizing the use of blockchain for a space application that involved only one country, such as the United States or Germany, then the technology security concerns or national security concerns are minimized. But in a global sector like the space industry, and the potential for openness and democratization that is provided by blockchain, they run into conflict with the fact that space technology, particularly the trade and transfer of such technologies cross-border, can be highly controlled by international frameworks and domestic law. And this is not just blueprints, specifications, parts, materials, rockets, or satellites themselves. The technology, the understanding, the know-how that may be on paper or maybe in an electronic form, but even if it is as analog as being stored in a human brain of people with particular expertise, can be very tightly controlled by law. They range from treaties such as the Arms Trade Treaty of 2013, of which, for example, Germany, Australia, New Zealand are all parties, to arrangements such as the Missile Technology Control Regime, the Wassenaar Arrangement, and domestic laws that exist in almost every country that is party to these arrangements, including the US, Germany, and Australia. The net effect of these laws or regulations or arrangements are that any transfer of know-how, information, technical data, specifications between countries relating to space technology are highly controlled and require licensing, very specific licensing by those countries before they can be transferred. When we talk about the sharing, as we did looking at this example, between different stakeholders, between launch provider, manufacturer, customer, operations, insurer, and regulators, when they are within one country, not so much of an issue. But if you have a satellite manufacturer that is based in Germany, of a customer that is based in the UAE, of which the operations and control center might be based in France, and the substantial shareholder in the UAE operator is American, then there is going to be significant sharing of this information, design specs, operational specs, commercial data, as well as the actual operations of the satellite itself. All of these are data, information, and technology that would be caught by these international and domestic frameworks. And the very nature of blockchain itself makes it very difficult to be able to pinpoint particular roadblocks or to create such roadblocks to ensure that the security of such technology and the prevention of illicit transfer of such technology from countries to non-friendly countries can be both scrutinized and controlled. And so while blockchain technology presents a significant potential for improving the development and the deployment of space technology, the inherent challenges and shortcomings of blockchain technology themselves, as well as the nature of blockchain in its decentralization and its openness, also means that there are significant legal and policy concerns that needs to be overcome before blockchain technology can be widely adapted and adopted by the space industry. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention. Please feel free to email and WhatsApp me both during the course of the conference and afterwards if you have any questions, or in particular, if you wish to correct me on anything that I may have misconstrued or misunderstood. I thank you all again for your time, and I look forward to the opportunity to meeting each and all of you in person one day soon. Thank you very much.